During her wedding, the bride froze upon seeing the groom's mother, the same woman who abandoned her as a child. With tears in her eyes, she interrupts the ceremony. The sun shines in a clear sky, illuminating the day Victoria has awaited her entire life. In the bridal room, she looks at herself in the mirror, dressed in her white gown, while her friends make final adjustments to her hair. Victoria's gaze reflects excitement and a peace she had never felt before. She thinks of David, her fiancé, and smiles tenderly, recalling how he has transformed her life, giving her the love and stability she always longed for. Robert, her adoptive father, enters the room to accompany her to the ceremony. "You are the most beautiful bride I have ever seen," he says, his eyes shining. Victoria feels a wave of gratitude toward him, the man who welcomed her and made her feel part of a family, her true father in every way. Clinging to his arm, Victoria takes a deep breath, ready to begin the next chapter of her life with David. As they enter the church, the murmurs of the guests cease, and the music begins to play softly. David, waiting for her at the altar, smiles as he sees her, his face lighting up with love. Victoria walks slowly, observing every detail of the church decorated for her special day, savoring each step, certain she is living the perfect moment. But halfway down the aisle, something changes. Turning her gaze, her eyes meet those of a woman seated among the guests in the front row. Time stops, sound fades, and the image of this woman is etched into her mind like a cold blow. A face she thought lost to the past looks back at her, and a chilling sensation fills her. It's Helen, David's mother, a figure she knew throughout their relationship, but had never observed so clearly until now. The years vanish, and Victoria is once again the confused and lost little girl. Memories assault her with painful images and buried feelings. Her mother, the same woman who left her, is here, so close, as if time had never passed. Helen's face, identical to the one Victoria stored deep in her memory, paralyzes her. The happiness she felt walking toward the altar fades, replaced by a wave of anguish that makes her stumble. Victoria stops, unable to take another step. David watches her from the altar, confused, and the murmurs among the guests begin to rise. With a broken heart and tears in her eyes, Victoria turns away from Helen's gaze and walks out of the church, her steps echoing as she leaves behind the altar and all the dreams she had placed in this day. David, shocked and bewildered, moves toward the aisle and calls out to Victoria, but she doesn't respond, her mind too overwhelmed to process anything beyond the pain of abandonment that suddenly resurfaces. The guests watch in astonishment as she departs, and the respectful silence shifts into a charged atmosphere of murmurs and confusion. Outside the church, Victoria runs, trying to put distance between herself and the nightmare she has just relived. She stops on the stairs, breathes deeply, but the air seems insufficient. Memories flood her, and the image of her mother, the woman who abandoned her, now appearing on the most important day of her life, leaves her shattered and lost. At that moment, Robert reaches her and takes her hand, his eyes filled with concern. "Victoria, what happened?" he asks with a soft, comforting voice, just as he has done so many times before. She looks at him, her eyes filled with tears, unable to explain what she feels, and mutters, "It's her. She's my mother." Robert, surprised, embraces her, offering the security and support she needs amid the emotional chaos enveloping her. Victoria clings to Robert, seeking solace in the arms that have always been her refuge, while inside the church, David, frozen at the altar, tries to understand what has just happened. Victoria stands outside the church, her breath ragged as she tries to calm down. The echo of her own steps in the silence only heightens her loneliness, the weight of revelation pressing on her chest. Each thought is a whirlwind dragging her further into the memory of the day she was abandoned. The image of Helen, the woman she had seen beside David so many times, now intertwines with that of her mother, the same one who left her as a defenseless child. Beside her, Robert watches her with a mix of sadness and worry. He had never seen Victoria so vulnerable, so defeated. Slowly, he approaches and places a hand on her shoulder. "Victoria, answer me what I'm asking," he whispers gently, fearing his voice might break her even more. Victoria looks up at him, her eyes red and full of tears. "Dad, it's her. David's mother is my biological mother." She barely manages to say the words without feeling the pain of her childhood returning with force, like an open wound that never healed. Robert, surprised, looks at her in silence, processing his daughter's revelation. He hugs her tightly, as if trying to protect her from the pain she feels, though he knows he can't erase the past. Inside the church, David, still in shock, tries to make sense of the scene he just witnessed. He looks toward the exit, where Victoria disappeared moments ago, and then back to Helen, who seems bewildered and nervous. Questions invade him, but the only certainty he has is that something very serious has occurred, something that directly affects Victoria, leaving him trapped in a suffocating uncertainty. Noticing David's gaze on her, Helen avoids eye contact and clutches her hands, revealing a tension he had never noticed in his mother. He attempts to approach her, but Helen steps back, saying she needs a moment to breathe. This only fuels David's suspicion, who begins to question his mother's sincerity and past. Outside the church, Victoria is still held tightly in Robert's embrace. "I know it's hard, my daughter, but you must be strong. I am here, as I've always been." His words calm Victoria's heart a bit, and she takes a breath, trying to regain some composure amid the chaos. But the pain of realizing her mother had been there all along, living a life without her, tears her apart. Inside the church, murmurs rise among the guests, who, without knowing what's really happening, begin to make assumptions and speculate about the situation. David, growing more desperate, leaves the church to search for Victoria. He finds her at the foot of the stairs, still trembling in Robert's arms, and he stops, observing the fragility of the woman he loves. Feeling David's presence, Victoria tries to compose herself, but the knot in her throat betrays her, and her tears continue to fall. David approaches, confused and hurt, and asks in a gentle voice, "Victoria, please, tell me what's happening." Victoria looks at him, the pain visible in her eyes, but she is unable to explain without feeling herself crumble once more. Instead, she can only say, "I need time, David. I need time to process this." Without further words, she turns to Robert, seeking his support, and decides to leave the church, leaving David without answers and lost in a sea of questions. As they walk away, David watches as his once secure future begins to waver under the weight of a secret he doesn't even understand. Victoria had returned to the church after calming down a bit outside, though the pain continued to throb within her like a constant reminder of the open wound of her past. As soon as she crossed the threshold, her gaze instinctively went to a corner where Helen stood, apart from the crowd of guests beginning to disperse. David's mother looked tense, her eyes downcast and shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing herself for a confrontation. Without hesitation, Victoria approached her, feeling a surge of anger and pain urging her to confront this woman. Once she was in front of Helen, the words came out with a firm tone, though stifled by anguish. "Why?" Victoria asked, looking at her with a mix of reproach and despair. "Why did you abandon me?" Helen slowly lifted her gaze, surprise and guilt flashing in her eyes. She seemed unable to find the right words, and for a few moments she simply stared at her in silence, as if the revelation of that truth had fallen on her with the same devastating weight as on Victoria. The seconds passed in thick silence, and Victoria felt the tension growing. Finally, Helen stammered, her voice barely audible. "Victoria, you don't know how sorry I am," she said, her voice trembling and heavy with a guilt that seemed to have accumulated over the years. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted you to be safe." Victoria felt fury rise in her chest. "Safe," she thought. The word sounded empty, incapable of justifying the abandonment, the emptiness she had felt all those years. Her mind sought a clearer explanation, something that could make sense of so much pain. She needed answers, not evasions. "Safe," Victoria repeated, raising her voice a bit and feeling the tears burn her eyes again. "Is that all you have to say? You left me without an explanation? And now you're David's mother. How could you just go on as if nothing happened?" Helen flinched at Victoria's words. She knew that no matter what she said, the damage was done. Even so, she tried to justify her past, searching her memory for the reasons she once thought valid, but that now seemed insignificant against her daughter's pain. "It was a decision that, at the time, I thought was best. I don't want to justify it, Victoria. I just want you to know, I did it thinking of your well-being." Victoria felt frustration build, forming a barrier that kept her from any empathy she might have felt. Her mother's words sounded empty, lacking the sincerity she'd hoped for. She stepped back, unable to bear the tension that surrounded them. "My well-being," Victoria said sarcastically, clenching her fists to contain the anger threatening to overflow. "If you really cared about my well-being, you wouldn't have abandoned me without a word. You left me to build another family, to have another child. What did David give you that I didn't deserve?" Helen, visibly shaken, raised a hand to her mouth, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Words seemed trapped in her throat, and for the first time, Victoria felt that perhaps her mother didn't have all the answers, that her own guilt and regret were insurmountable barriers. "Forgive me," Helen whispered, barely able to hold her daughter's gaze. "I don't expect you to right away, but I promise I'll explain everything when you're ready to listen. I just need time." Those words felt like an insult to Victoria, a new evasion. With her heart wounded and her mind full of unanswered questions, she turned away from Helen, feeling that the promise of an explanation, when she was ready, was insufficient for the pain she carried. Her eyes reflected a mixture of anger and sadness, emotions Helen could see but seemed incapable of soothing. Without another word, Victoria turned and walked away, leaving Helen in that dark corner of the church, alone with her own regrets and remorse. Each step took her further from the woman who was once her mother, and who now, after so long, seemed little more than a stranger. As Victoria left, David, who had been watching the interaction from afar, felt doubt and suspicion beginning to take hold of him. Something significant and painful was happening, something his mother had hidden from him and that now threatened to destroy everything. The pain in his chest grew, mixing with a desperation he couldn't fully understand. The scene he had just witnessed filled him with confusion. The way Victoria looked at his mother, Helen, the silence heavy with something dark and hidden that seemed to bind them. His mind kept circling the question that repeated endlessly. What could exist between them to cause such a devastating reaction in Victoria? David's friends, who had kept their distance until then, approached with worried expressions. Among them, Eduardo, his best friend and confidant since childhood, looked at him with a mix of surprise and sympathy. Eduardo placed a hand on David's shoulder, trying to offer some reassurance. "Are you okay, David?" he asked quietly, respecting the gravity of the moment. David nodded slowly, but his thoughts remained trapped in the chaos of the situation. "I don't know, Eduardo. I don't understand what happened. Something serious has happened, but Victoria hasn't told me anything." "Why did she leave like that?" he murmured, clenching his fists in frustration. Eduardo watched him silently, trying to find the right words. He knew how much Victoria meant to David, and seeing his friend devastated deeply affected him. After a few moments of reflection, he decided to advise him to look for more answers before jumping to conclusions. "Maybe you should talk to your mother. I don't know what happened, but she was there when Victoria stopped. She might know something or at least give you some clue about what happened," he suggested, keeping a sympathetic tone. David nodded, realizing Eduardo was right. Helen had been present, and her reaction had been strange, almost evasive. He recalled how she had lowered her gaze, as if she knew something he didn't. The thought filled him with growing discomfort. He had always trusted his mother, her strength, and the love she had shown him throughout his life. But now, remembering her expression in the church, a doubt, a crack, threatened to spread. Gathering his courage, David approached Helen, who sat on one of the church benches, her gaze distant and her hands entwined, as if trying to hold back an invisible tremor. When she saw him coming, her face showed a mix of surprise and anxiety. She seemed to anticipate the confrontation that, deep down, she knew had to happen. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth," David said with a firm tone, looking her straight in the eye. "What happened between you and Victoria? Why did she react like that?" Helen swallowed hard and averted her gaze, unable to meet the intensity in her son's eyes. Her lips trembled as if the words were trapped in some deep corner of her mind, resisting release. The silence that followed only fed David's growing uncertainty. "David, son, Helen began, but then stopped, as if reconsidering what she was about to say. Her voice was weak, broken by a mix of guilt and anguish. "There are things from the past, things I did thinking they were right. I don't know if Victoria could ever understand." David felt his frustration building. His mother's evasive answers irritated him and at the same time filled him with concern. He moved a little closer, frowning, his heart pounding. "What things from the past? Mom, I need you to be honest with me. I can't go on without knowing what's going on," he insisted, clenching his fists at his sides. Helen looked away and shook her head, clearly unable to confront the truth he was asking for. "I can't tell you everything now, David. I just ask you to trust me. When the right time comes, I'll tell you. But now, I need time," she whispered. Her words filled him with helplessness. "I need time." Those words felt like a wall, a vague, non-committal response that left him feeling hollow. David sensed something breaking within him, a fracture in the trust he had always had in his mother. It was the first time Helen withheld something important from him, and the revelation left him cold. Unable to get more answers, David withdrew, feeling a mix of pain and mistrust. Doubts had been deeply sown in his mind, and each step he took seemed to lead him further from the certainty he'd once felt in his life. He looked at the guests, at the friends who watched him with concern, and realized that the image of his family, once perfect and stable, was beginning to crumble. As the ceremony unraveled and murmurs filled the air, David began to question everything he had ever known. Something had changed irreversibly, and the first crack in his relationship with his mother had appeared. Now, the only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't move forward without answers, and the suspicion that his mother had hidden secrets that could destroy everything began to grow like a shadow in his heart. Victoria sat on a bench in a park near the church, surrounded by trees that swayed slowly with the breeze. Robert sat beside her, silent, respecting the space filled with painful memories that enveloped her. Around them, the world continued, but Victoria felt trapped in an eternal moment, as if fragments of her childhood were unfolding before her, forcing her to relive what she thought she had buried. She clenched her hands tightly in her lap, closing her eyes to hold back the tears fighting to escape. The image of Helen, her biological mother, appeared again and again in her mind, bringing with it scenes from her childhood, from a time when she still believed in the promise of a stable home and a mother's love. She remembered the feeling of emptiness, the confusion of being a child without explanation, searching for a face she never saw again until today, and felt a deep wound reopen. "Dad," Victoria said in a faint voice, looking at him with eyes full of sadness, "I never imagined I'd see my mother again, and much less like this." Robert looked at her, pain mirrored on his own face. He knew how much Victoria had suffered since she came into his life, filled with questions and a soul broken by loss. He had been a father to her, a refuge, watching her grow as she tried to overcome the abandonment. But that wound had always been there, even though Victoria hid it, and now the past had caught up with her at the most unexpected moment. "Victoria, I'm so sorry you have to go through this," Robert replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "If there's anything I can do to help, to ease even a little of this pain, don't hesitate to let me know." She looked at him, grateful for the unconditional support of the man who had always been her true father. But Robert's words couldn't lift the weight of reality. Her biological mother, the woman who had left her without explanation, had gone on to create a new life. Not only that, but she had built a family, a life in which Victoria had no place. "All this time, I thought maybe there was a reason, something that might explain why she left me," Victoria murmured, her eyes lost somewhere on the horizon. "But now I see that she simply chose to move on, form another family, have another child, as if I had never existed." The pain in her voice was evident. Victoria felt a mix of anger and helplessness consuming her. How could a mother abandon her daughter without an explanation? And worse, how could she reappear years later, as if the past had never happened? Robert sighed, understanding Victoria's internal struggle, but unsure how to ease such profound pain. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, and that the wound of abandonment was embedded within her in a way he could never completely heal. "Victoria, I know this has hurt you for years, and I know it's difficult to understand others' decisions. But remember, you are strong. You've achieved so much, even with everything you carry inside. You've built your life despite that absence." Victoria nodded slowly, understanding Robert's words, but feeling they were insufficient to calm the pain. She had indeed built a life, but that life was marked by loss, by the constant reminder that she had been abandoned by the person who should have loved her most. She had tried to ignore the wound, to hide it behind the facade of a strong and independent woman, but the truth was that the void had always been there. "The worst part," Victoria continued in a whisper, "is that now, for the first time, I feel torn. I don't know if I can go on with David, knowing that he's part of the family that left me behind." Robert listened in silence, recognizing the internal battle Victoria faced. He knew how much she loved David, and also understood that the love she felt for him was now entangled in the complicated web of her past. The betrayal she felt toward Helen echoed in every word, and Robert feared Victoria might end up losing David over something he couldn't control. "Victoria, David isn't to blame for what his mother did. He loves you, that's clear, and I think he'd support any decision you make. But you need to give yourself time to understand what you truly feel, to decide what you want to do about all of this." Victoria nodded slowly, though the feeling of emptiness remained, persistent. She knew Robert was right. It wasn't fair to hold David accountable for Helen's decisions. However, the pain and confusion were so profound that it was almost impossible for her to separate David from the betrayal of his mother. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with warm colors, Victoria felt a dark shadow clinging to her soul. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, that facing the past would not be easy, and that the answers she sought might not bring her the peace she longed for. David spent the following days mired in a storm of emotions he couldn't fully grasp. The image of Victoria fleeing the church without explanation, his mother's evasive conversation, and the weight of secrets that seemed to engulf his life kept him awake at night. He felt that the solid ground on which he had built his relationship and family was starting to crumble, leaving him in unbearable uncertainty. One afternoon, as he wandered aimlessly through the city trying to sort out his thoughts, he decided to seek out Eduardo, his lifelong friend who had always been his voice of reason in tough times. Arriving at the cafe where they often met, he found Eduardo waiting with a sympathetic expression. David barely sat down before the desperation he had been holding back spilled out in a torrent of words. "I don't know what's happening, Eduardo," he began, his face lined with anguish. "Victoria has avoided me since the wedding day. We've hardly spoken, and when I try to ask her what happened, She just pulls away. My mother also refuses to tell me the truth. I feel like everything I believed in is in ruins. Eduardo listened silently, nodding as David vented. He knew enough about the situation to understand the chaos consuming his friend, and after a few seconds, he decided to speak candidly. David, I know this is complicated and painful, but you have to try to see things from another perspective. It's clear that Victoria is dealing with something very personal, something that, for some reason, involves your mother. Maybe she needs time before she can explain what's happening. He paused before adding, but from what you're telling me, it also sounds like your mother has secrets she's avoiding. David nodded, but the thought that his mother could hide something so significant was incomprehensible to him. He had grown up trusting her, seeing her as a strong and honest woman, and now the idea that she harbored secrets devastated him. Do you think my mother has lied to me my whole life? David asked, feeling the weight of his own words. If that's true, I don't know if I can trust her again. Eduardo placed a hand on his shoulder and sighed with empathy. Look, my friend, we don't know the whole story, but it's possible she had her reasons. Sometimes people keep secrets thinking they're protecting their loved ones, though that isn't always the right thing to do. Don't jump to conclusions. Try to get the truth first. And perhaps to do that, you'll need to confront your mother and demand answers. David considered Eduardo's words in silence. He knew his friend was right, but he also understood that the truth, whatever it was, would forever change the way he saw his mother. The idea of confronting her filled him with both fear and anger, a mix he was unprepared to process. Yet he also realized that his relationship with Victoria hung by a thread, and that thread could only hold if he managed to understand the pain that kept her distant. Later that night, David went to his parents' house, determined to speak with Helen. Entering, he found her alone in the living room, sitting with her hands clasped on her lap, staring out the window. She seemed lost in thought, and for a moment, David felt his mother looked vulnerable, as though trapped in an internal struggle. However, the pain in his chest was stronger than the compassion he usually felt toward her. "Mum, we need to talk," he said firmly, positioning himself in front of her. Helen looked up, and for a moment, a shadow of guilt crossed her face. Yet she took a deep breath and nodded, as if knowing this moment had been inevitable since the wedding day. "Tell me, David, what do you want to know?" she asked, her voice trembling, as though her words weighed a ton. David felt tension take over his body, but he didn't let the emotion stop him. "I want to know what happened between you and Victoria. Something from her past has deeply affected her, and somehow it involves you. Why did she react that way upon seeing you? What did you do to make her run away like that?" Helen lowered her gaze, unable to meet her son's intensity. Her silence only deepened David's frustration, who felt his patience waning. "David, it's a complicated story, a painful one for everyone involved. I did things I thought were necessary at the time, but now I realize I may have been wrong," she replied, sadness weighing in her voice, sadness she seemed to have carried for years. David looked at her, not fully understanding. "What things, Mom? What did you do?" Helen raised a hand to her face, trying to hold back tears, and after a moment of silence, she confessed what she had long avoided. Victoria is my daughter, David. She's the child I had before I met you, before building this life with you. I abandoned her when she was a child, and I haven't had the courage to face her until now." Her confession hit David like a blow. For a few seconds, his mind struggled to process the enormity of his mother's words. The woman he had trusted as a pillar in his life, the mother who had always been his refuge, was now revealing a secret that threatened to tear everything apart. His breathing quickened, and a sense of betrayal began to consume him. "You abandoned Victoria?" David repeated, a mix of horror and disillusionment in his voice. How could you do something like that and not tell me?" Helen, visibly affected, tried to reach out to him, but David stepped back, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. His world had changed in an instant, and everything he knew about his family was now tainted by a past he had never imagined. "David, I'm sorry," Helen said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I understand I wasn't. I've regretted that decision every day, but I thought keeping it silent would protect everyone, including you." David shook his head, unable to process what he'd just heard. The betrayal he felt was beyond what he could bear, and the pain of knowing that his mother had abandoned Victoria, the woman he loved, left him devastated. Without another word, David walked away, leaving Helen in the living room, broken and filled with regret. The revelation plunged him into a deep crisis. His love for Victoria and his loyalty to his mother now clashed in a dilemma he couldn't resolve. At that moment, he understood that his life would never be the same, and the weight of his mother's decisions now rested on his shoulders, trapping him in a painful crossroads between love and family. Victoria spent the following days lost in a maze of thoughts and emotions that drained her. The revelation that Helen, David's mother, was also her biological mother, had opened a wound so deep she could barely understand it. The woman who had abandoned her without explanation was now appearing in her life like a ghost, and worst of all, she seemed to have done it by choice, to build a new family, a new life. In her despair, Victoria realized she couldn't live with the uncertainty of what had really happened in her past. She needed answers, an explanation that went beyond Helen's vague apologies. She knew that the pain would only deepen if she didn't understand the reason behind the abandonment that had marked her since childhood. So, in search of those answers, she decided to go to her trusted friend, Mary. One afternoon, they met at Mary's apartment, a cozy and safe space where Victoria felt comfortable. Mary listened attentively as Victoria told her everything, every detail of her discovery, and the pain she felt, knowing that Helen, the woman she thought she knew as the mother of her future husband, was in reality the mother she had always longed to find. Moved, Mary held her hand firmly. "Victoria, if your mother can't give you the answers you need, then let's find them ourselves," Mary said, determined. "Maybe there's something in the records, in old archives. There may be people from the past who still remember what happened. You can't live with this uncertainty." Her friend's words gave Victoria new strength. Though it pained her, she knew the only way to heal was to fully understand the past. And so, together, they began their search for the truth. First, the archive searches. Victoria and Mary went to the municipal records office, a dusty and seldom visited place, hoping to find some document that might offer a clue about Helen's past. After several hours of searching through old files, they finally found a record with Helen's name. Reading it, they discovered surprising information. Helen had been married in her youth to a man named Frank, someone Victoria didn't remember at all. Victoria felt a pang of pain and confusion upon reading Frank's name, but also an odd urgency to know more. The information about Frank showed he had a history of violence, even having been under investigation for abuse complaints against his wife. This man, a ghost from her past, had once been part of her life and possibly the reason behind the events that followed. Next, visits to old neighbors. With this information in mind, Victoria and Mary decided to visit Helen's former home, a small and dilapidated building in a neighborhood on the outskirts of town. They questioned a few neighbors and, after some hours, found an older woman named Teresa, who remembered Helen and the man she had lived with at that time. Teresa shared that life hadn't been easy for Helen back then. She was a beautiful young woman, very kind, but she always looked sad, Teresa recalled. "I used to see bruises on her arms, though she never mentioned them. Her husband, Frank, was a dangerous man, always in a foul mood and with a threatening look in his eyes. Honestly, dear, I always thought she had no choice but to leave." Victoria listened silently, her heart tight and tears held back. She was beginning to understand the magnitude of Helen's sacrifice, though it didn't lessen the pain of her own abandonment. As Teresa continued her story, pieces started to fall into place. Helen had been trapped in an abusive relationship and had finally, in a moment of desperation, escaped, leaving everything behind. But then, why hadn't she taken her along? Why hadn't she fought to keep her in her life? Finally, the notes from an old legal record. Teresa gave them one last suggestion: to search in the legal archives. Determined, Victoria went to the courthouse records office, and after a long wait, they found a complaint Helen had filed against Frank. In the report, Helen described the years of abuse she had endured and how she feared for her life and that of her daughter. Victoria felt a mixture of sadness and understanding as she read the document. The woman she had thought of as the mother who abandoned her without reason had, in reality, been living a nightmare, trapped in a relationship that stripped her of any chance to be a mother. That decision to abandon her, while painful, had been motivated by a desperate need to save herself. However, a persistent ache remained in her heart. While she could now see the enormity of her mother's suffering, the reality was that Helen had gone on to build a new life, a life that didn't include the daughter she left behind. Victoria couldn't help but feel the betrayal of that choice. Yes, Helen had escaped a hell, but she had chosen to rebuild her life without her. The conclusion of their investigation. Later that afternoon, Victoria and Mary sat in a cafe, exhausted and filled with mixed emotions. Victoria gazed out the window at the rain falling, trying to process everything she had uncovered. "How do you feel now?" Mary asked, trying to read her friend's expression. Victoria took a while to respond. She looked at her coffee cup, her thoughts still caught between the past and the present. "I understand that my mother was afraid, that she tried to escape and protect herself. I can see that she also suffered, that maybe she did it to save herself," she replied in a whisper. "But it still hurts, Mary. It still hurts to think she chose to move on without me, that she built a new family without even trying to find me afterward." Mary squeezed her hand, offering silent support. She knew there were no words that could soothe the storm of emotions Victoria was facing. It was a blend of betrayal, understanding, and deep pain that wouldn't easily dissipate. That day, Victoria understood that her mother's story was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Although that truth offered some comfort, it didn't erase the sense of abandonment that had marked her life. She knew that the next step would be to confront Helen with all the information she now held and decide if she was ready to forgive and heal, or if she preferred to maintain the distance she had built over the years. The discovery that Helen had abandoned Victoria to escape a life of abuse and then chosen to start a new family left David in a state of confusion and pain he couldn't resolve. During those days, he sank into silence, dealing with his mother's betrayal and the weight of his own feelings for Victoria. The situation had fractured the stability of the family he had valued so much, and now all the certainties he had held firm were crumbling. Elizabeth, his younger sister, who until then was unaware of the truth, had begun to sense the tension hanging over the home. Initially, their mother avoided any direct conversation about what had happened at the church, limiting herself to maintaining appearances. But Elizabeth's unease was growing, and finally, one night, she decided to confront her mother. Helen was in the kitchen, attempting to distract herself by making dinner, when Elizabeth entered with a serious and determined expression. Her eyes reflected a mix of discomfort and sadness. She knew something had changed in her mother and David's relationship, and she was determined to discover the truth. "Mum, I need you to tell me what's going on," Elizabeth said, leaning on the counter and staring at her. "Something happened on David's wedding day, something that's affected everyone. Why is everything so broken?" Helen sighed, realizing she could no longer hide the truth from her youngest daughter. She knew this moment would come, but facing it was more painful than she had anticipated. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet Elizabeth's questioning eyes. "It's complicated, Elizabeth," she began, her voice breaking. There are things from my past I never told you about because I thought it was best for you." Elizabeth, confused, frowned. "What things?" "Mom, you're the person I've admired most in my life. But now I feel like I don't know you. I need you to be honest with me." Helen nodded sadly and, taking a deep breath, decided to reveal what she had hidden for so long. She confessed that, before meeting her father, she had had another daughter, Victoria, whom she had left years ago to escape an abusive relationship. Elizabeth listened to every word with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment, her eyes fixed on her mother as the story unfolded like a dark veil over the image she had of her. "So, you abandoned Victoria? You left her, and then built a new family?" Elizabeth asked, her voice laden with sadness she couldn't hide. Helen nodded and tried to explain the circumstances, the desperation that had driven her to make that decision, but Elizabeth only heard the echo of the words, "You left her." The image of her strong, loving mother began to crumble in her mind, and the pain of knowing that Helen had abandoned her own daughter was too much to process in that moment. "I don't understand how you could do that," Elizabeth murmured, feeling her trust in Helen shattering. "I thought I knew you. I saw you as a perfect mother, but now I feel like you've lied to me my entire life." Helen tried to reach out to her daughter, extending a hand, but Elizabeth pulled away, unable to hide the disappointment in her eyes. The coldness in her gaze reflected the pain and confusion that now filled her heart. Without another word, Elizabeth left the kitchen, leaving Helen alone with her remorse. Meanwhile, David was facing his own emotional dilemma. The days of silence and distance between him and Victoria were tearing him apart. The tension between them had grown to the point where they felt increasingly distant, and David feared that the revelation of their family ties had irreparably damaged their relationship. However, he knew that to support Victoria, he first needed to process his own feelings. A few days after the conversation between Elizabeth and their mother, David tried to reach out to Victoria. He found her at her house, and though she still maintained a certain emotional distance, she let him in. They both sat in the living room, surrounded by an uncomfortable silence, until David decided to speak. "Victoria, I know. All of this is chaos, and I understand that you have reasons to be upset with me," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "But I want you to know that, despite everything, I love you. My mother, she hid the truth from me too. I didn't know anything about her past or her connection to you." Victoria looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and exhaustion. Despite her feelings for David, she couldn't ignore the resentment she felt toward Helen, nor the impact her story had had on her life. She knew David wasn't responsible, but the mere fact that he was part of the family that had hurt her so deeply made everything more complicated. "I can't deny what I feel for you, David, but I also can't ignore what your mother did," Victoria replied, her voice trembling. "My entire life, I've lived with that wound, and now, seeing that she had another family, with you and Elizabeth, it makes me feel like I never mattered." David nodded, understanding Victoria's pain, and felt a deep sadness at not being able to ease her suffering. He knew that the love they shared was being tested in ways they had never imagined, and the helplessness of not being able to change the past consumed him. The voice of his best friend, Eduardo, echoed in his mind, reminding him that their relationship was at a critical point and that he needed to be careful not to push too hard. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was grappling with her own feelings of betrayal. She had idolized her mother her whole life, seeing her as an example of strength and sacrifice, but now that image was crumbling. The idea that her mother had abandoned a daughter filled her with doubts about everything she believed she knew. She decided to distance herself emotionally from Helen, feeling she needed time to process the reality and reassess their relationship. The family crisis began to affect every aspect of David, Elizabeth, and Helen's lives. Every conversation at home was tense. The prolonged silences felt like insurmountable barriers, and the unity they once shared seemed increasingly fragile. Deep down, David feared his relationship with Victoria was doomed. He knew she needed time to heal, and although he wanted to be by her side, he also understood that he might lose her in the process. His love was strong, but the secrets and pain of the past had created a rift that only time could help to bridge. That night, David made a decision. He would give Victoria the space she needed. He would support her from a distance and show her that, despite the shadows of their respective pasts, he was willing to wait for her and fight for a future together. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he understood that true love isn't only proven in joyful moments, but also in the darkest. The Mendoza family was fractured, each member wrestling with their own emotions and recently revealed secrets. Victoria, although supported by David, kept her distance, knowing she needed time to find peace within herself. Elizabeth, still in disbelief, looked at her mother with new eyes, feeling that the pedestal she once had her on was slowly crumbling. And at the center of it all, Helen remained silent, burdened by the weight of her past and the regret of her decisions, knowing that her family might never be the same. The following days passed in a fog for Victoria. Each moment was marked by the recent discovery of her biological mother and the revelation of her painful past. She was enveloped by conflicting emotions, and while she was grateful for Robert's support and David's patient closeness, she knew that there were parts of her pain she could only face alone. So, one night, in the solitude of her room, she decided to revisit her past and relive her childhood memories, even if it meant reopening the wounds she had tried to close for so long. Victoria began recalling those early years of her life, when she was just a little girl, filled with questions and fears. Her mind transported her to nights when, as a very young child, she would wake up alone in the dark, waiting in vain for her mother to return. She remembered the anguish of not understanding why she had been left behind, the emptiness of living without an explanation. Her childhood, though filled with happy moments with Robert, had always been marked by the shadow of abandonment, an invisible wound that had followed her into adulthood. She remembered how, as she grew older, she tried to find answers on her own. As a teenager, she had asked her adoptive father about her biological mother, hoping for a clue that would help her understand. Robert had always explained that, although he didn't know all the details, the woman who left her probably had her reasons, even if those reasons couldn't lessen her pain. Robert's words echoed in her mind, especially on those dark days of her adolescence when Victoria felt that abandonment defined her. She had constantly struggled to accept that perhaps her mother had left her for a reason greater than herself. Yet the void of not having a biological mother present had marked her sense of identity. Robert had loved her unconditionally, giving her the security of a home, and yet that absence continued to haunt her. Victoria revisited tender moments with Robert, who had supported her at every step of her life. She remembered how he helped her with homework, took her to the park, and stayed up with her on nights when sadness overwhelmed her. For her, Robert had been the figure who filled her with love and security, the person she trusted unconditionally, and the man who had given her the strength to move forward. She knew that without him, she never would have had the stability she so desperately needed to become who she was today. But the pain persisted. In every memory, Victoria found the shadows of an absent mother, of a story she had never heard in full. She remembered how, at school, she would listen to her friends talk about their mothers, how they helped, consoled, and advised them. And though she always loved Robert, there was a sadness she couldn't dispel, the loneliness of knowing that the person who brought her into the world chose not to stay in her life. Loss and resentment intertwined in her mind, creating a mix of anger and pain that tore at her. Though she now knew that Helen had lived through hell in her relationship with Frank, she still found it hard to accept that her mother's final decision was to leave her behind. It was as if a part of her had always hoped, deep down, that her mother would have fought harder, that she would have found some way to stay with her. But the reality was that she had grown up without her, and that wound wasn't easy to close. As her memories continued to flow, Victoria began to realize that the pain of her childhood and the abandonment she felt were the roots of her current insecurities. She had learned to love with a kind of caution, afraid that any deep relationship might lead her to experience another loss. In past relationships, and even to some extent in her relationship with David, she had always harbored that shadow of insecurity, the doubt of whether she truly deserved the love and stability he offered her. Now, looking back, she understood where that fear came from, that constant anxiety that accompanied her. The memories also reminded her of the times when Robert had been her salvation. The image of him teaching her to ride a bike, helping her prepare for her first school presentations, and standing by her door to say goodnight whenever she needed him, brought back a sense of warmth. Robert had been everything she needed back then, the father who welcomed her when she needed it most. And though he never tried to replace her mother, he had given her stability and unconditional love. Yet that night, alone in her room, Victoria also realized that she had never truly healed the wound of abandonment. The past still weighed on her, carrying a rage she hadn't managed to release. She knew that holding on to that resentment only kept her trapped, anchored to a pain that prevented her from fully moving forward. Finally, she closed her eyes and let the tears flow. With each tear, she began to accept that her biological mother had made difficult decisions, choices she could never change, but that didn't necessarily define her. It was the first step in a process that would still take time, but one she knew she had to undertake if she wanted to free herself from the weight of her past. In that moment, a gentle determination arose within her. She needed to confront Helen once more, but this time with the intention of finding some form of closure, a path to peace. It wasn't just about getting answers, but about understanding and accepting that, although abandonment marked her story, she could decide the direction of her future. The night wore on, and Victoria felt exhausted, but also relieved. At least now she understood that healing didn't depend solely on her mother's explanations, but on her own ability to accept and release the pain. She decided that she would talk to Robert the next day, to share her feelings, and perhaps thank him once again for the love and patience with which he had raised her. She knew there was a long road ahead, but she also understood that, to move toward a future with or without David, she had to close the cycles of her past, a past that could no longer completely define her. The days of silence and tension in the Mendoza family had reached an unsustainable point. David felt that the weight of the truth had become an unbreakable barrier between him and his mother. Although Helen had confessed to abandoning Victoria and the reasons behind it, he still needed to understand why his family had hidden this secret from him, especially his father, James, who had always been a figure of rectitude and honesty in his life. That night, David decided that he also needed to confront his father to find out if he knew about this hidden past. James was in his study, lost in his own thoughts when David found him. The dim light in the room and James's tired gaze revealed that he, too, was affected by the family's tension. Seeing David standing in the doorway, James gestured for him to sit, understanding that an important conversation was about to take place. "Dad, I need to know the truth," David said firmly, breaking the silence in the room. "I can't go on without understanding everything that's happened. Did you know about Victoria? Did you know that Mom had a daughter before we were born?" James nodded slowly, without looking directly at him, as though David's words were the weight he had been dreading. After a deep sigh, he began to speak in a subdued voice, filled with guilt and resignation. "Yes, David. I knew from the beginning. I knew that Helen had a daughter, but I never imagined that secret would come back to us in this way," he admitted, looking at his son with a mixture of sadness and regret. David felt his chest tighten. His father's confession was an unexpected blow, although he had assumed his mother had hidden this past. Discovering that James also knew and had chosen to remain silent filled him with a rage he couldn't control. "Why?" David asked, his voice breaking with disappointment. "Why did you hide something so important from me? I always thought honesty was a fundamental value in our family, and now I find out that everything has been a lie." James lowered his gaze, visibly affected by his son's pain. After a moment of silence, he gathered the courage to respond. "When I met your mother, she was broken, David. She had left behind a life full of abuse and suffering. She didn't want that past to haunt her, so I promised her we would build a new life, one where she could be happy. I thought that if we kept the past quiet, we could protect our family from a truth that would only bring pain." David shook his head, unable to accept his father's justification. He felt that his parents' decisions had not only betrayed him, but also Victoria, who had grown up with a wound they chose to ignore. "So you just decided to ignore Victoria? You decided that she didn't have the right to be part of our family," David said, his voice filled with bitterness. "That protection you talk about was just a way to avoid facing the consequences of your actions. While you built a life here, she grew up with the pain of having been abandoned." James remained silent, unable to counter the truth David had just voiced. He knew that the decision to keep the secret had come at a high cost, but he never imagined that price would include the trust of his own son. For the first time, he clearly saw the damage his silence had caused, and the weight of regret overwhelmed him. "David, you're right. There's no justification that can ease what we did," he finally responded, his voice breaking. "There are no words to repair the damage we caused. I can't ask you to forgive me or even understand, but I want you to know that my intention was always to protect our family. I never imagined I would end up hurting you this way." David looked at him, a mix of sadness and disillusionment in his eyes. Though he understood his father was trying to be sincere, the damage was already done. The family he had always admired, the stability he believed unbreakable, was crumbling before his eyes. The figure of his father, a model of integrity in his life, now appeared vulnerable and filled with flaws. The silence that followed was thick, laden with emotions and unspoken words. David, feeling the distance between him and his father grow even larger, rose and headed toward the door, but paused for a moment before leaving. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to understand this, Dad. And I don't know if I can go on in this family, knowing my life was built on secrets and lies. But I need time, and I think that's the only thing you can give me right now." Without waiting for an answer, David walked out of the study, leaving James with a distant gaze and a guilt that, he now understood, would haunt him for the rest of his days. That night, David sank into his thoughts. The conversation with his father had made it clear that his family had acted, believing silence could be a shield, but that shield had only caused pain and fractures. He felt that his home, once a safe haven, was now a strange place, full of shadows. He decided to go for a walk to clear his mind, and almost without realizing it, he found himself at Victoria's door. She opened it, surprised to see him at that hour, and they both stood in silence for a few seconds. Without words, David felt that she understood the confusion enveloping him, and that gave him the courage to open up. "My father knew too, Victoria. He knew everything about you and decided to keep it secret. He said he did it to protect my mother, to protect us. But I can't stop thinking about the pain that decision caused you," he said, his voice heavy with a sadness he couldn't hide. Victoria looked at him with understanding, for the pain David now felt was something she had carried for years. Gently, she invited him to sit, and David, exhausted, sank into the sofa as Victoria sat beside him, offering her silent support. "David, it's not easy to accept that the people we love are also capable of making such big mistakes," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "But although your parents hurt me deeply, you don't have to carry that guilt. They made their decisions, but you can decide what to do with the future." David nodded, grateful for her words, though the weight of the truth still burdened his heart. He knew that the road to forgiveness and healing would be long and challenging for both of them, but at that moment, he felt that despite the shadows of the past, there was still a light they could cling to together. That night, Victoria and David stayed up talking until the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon. They shared their fears, their doubts, and for the first time since everything was revealed, they felt closer than ever, like two souls marked by the same pain, but finding in each other the strength to move forward. The weight of the truth had fallen on them, but together they decided they would fight to prevent the mistakes of their parents from defining their destiny. The following days were intense for Victoria. Though the conversation with David had helped her find a spark of hope and support amid the pain, she knew that the emotional burden of her childhood and the resentment she felt toward Helen could only be alleviated if she took steps to heal. So, after careful thought, she decided to start therapy. She knew that facing her past would require a courage she had yet to explore, but she was willing to try. In her first session, Victoria sat across from the therapist, a warm and understanding woman, and tried to explain her story. At first, the words were difficult to say, as if each one reminded her of the pain she had tried so hard to hide. But slowly, she found a way to open up and share what she had experienced. The first memories that surfaced were from her childhood. Victoria spoke about moments when she felt rejected, nights when she went to bed hoping for answers that never came. She expressed the confusion of growing up feeling different, not understanding why her mother had left her behind, why her love had been replaced by a void that she had never managed to fill. The therapist listened silently, nodding empathetically as Victoria delved into her memories. "I always felt like there was something in me that didn't deserve to be loved," Victoria confessed in a whisper. "I thought that my mother leaving was my fault, that I wasn't enough for her. That feeling has followed me my whole life, and though I now understand her reasons, I can't help feeling broken." The therapist observed her with understanding, letting her words fill the space before responding. "Victoria, abandonment is a deeply traumatic experience, especially when it comes from someone as important as a mother. But it's essential to understand that what your mother did doesn't define your worth. Her decisions reflect her own fears and circumstances, not who you are as a person. Sometimes, the first step to healing is freeing ourselves from the guilt we carry inside, even if it's not ours to bear." In the following sessions, Victoria began to work on releasing the anger and resentment she felt toward her mother. Through exercises and reflections, the therapist helped her explore the repressed emotions she had accumulated since childhood. Victoria realized that her anger was not only directed at Helen, but also at herself for having avoided confronting her feelings for so long. It was as if she had buried the pain so deeply that now it seemed to resurface with greater force than ever. One day, during a session, Victoria completed an exercise the therapist suggested, writing a letter to Helen, expressing everything she felt, without holding back. At first, she felt uncomfortable, doubting she could put into words the complexity of her pain and disappointment. But with each word she wrote, she felt a weight lift from her heart. The letter became an outlet for years of silence and pent-up resentment. "Dear Helen," she began, "I don't know if you'll ever understand how much you've hurt me. Since I was a child, I've felt your absence as an open wound, as a question without an answer. I've always wondered why you didn't fight for me, why you didn't try to stay in my life. I know your past was difficult, but that doesn't change the fact that I felt abandoned, as if I wasn't enough for you. I've spent my life trying to be strong, to fill the emptiness you left, but there are days when the pain is so great that I feel broken." As she continued the letter, Victoria allowed herself to express both her pain and her desire to free herself from the past. She knew that holding on to resentment only kept her prisoner, and she understood that forgiveness was not to absolve her mother, but to allow herself to move forward. "Forgiving doesn't mean I'll forget what you did to me," she wrote at the end of the letter, "but it does mean I'm willing to let go of the hatred so that I no longer hurt myself. I don't know if we'll ever have a relationship, but I want you to know that I'm trying to heal, and that's the only thing I can offer you now." Finishing the letter brought her unexpected relief. Not that the pain disappeared immediately, but for the first time, she experienced the possibility of letting go of some of the resentment that had consumed her for so many years. Therapy had helped her understand that forgiveness was an act of love toward herself, a step toward emotional freedom. Over the weeks, Victoria began to notice small changes in her life. Though the pain was still present, it no longer felt as overwhelming. In her encounters with David, she noticed that she could speak more openly about her feelings without the constant fear of losing him. She understood that her relationship with him was also in a process of healing, and that the love they shared was a powerful force helping them face challenges together. On the other hand, David continued to be her support, though with respect and without pressure. He knew Victoria needed time to heal, and he accepted that his role was to accompany her without trying to resolve everything for her. This mutual understanding strengthened them, and both clung to the idea of building a future together based on truth and respect. As Victoria progressed in her healing journey, she also became more aware of the importance of her relationship with Robert. In one of their conversations, Victoria thanked her adoptive father for everything he had given her, for being her guide and her refuge when she needed it most. Robert, moved, reminded her that she would always be his daughter, regardless of the circumstances, and that he would be there for her until the end. Finally, Victoria understood that Robert's love had been the constant in her life, proof that, although her biological mother had left her, there was always someone willing to love her unconditionally. With his support and David's, Victoria felt she could face anything, even the wounds of the past. Therapy had taught her that healing was a process, one that didn't happen overnight. But with each step, she felt a little freer. She knew there were still things to resolve, conversations to have, and that complete forgiveness was not something that came all at once, but a choice she would make day by day. But now, at least, she felt more at peace with her past and better prepared to build a future where her wounds did not define her identity. Deep down, Victoria felt that she was finally beginning to find peace within herself and with the fragments of her story that had once torn her apart. She was ready to face the next step, confident that healing would not only bring her closer to herself, but also to the people she truly loved. After weeks of therapy and confronting the memories and feelings she had long kept hidden, Victoria felt ready to face Helen once more. She was no longer looking for answers or a justification that could erase the pain, but something deeper: peace. She wanted to close the chapter of her past and move toward a future where she was no longer anchored to resentment. With that decision in mind, she asked Helen to meet her at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes and the weight of their complicated family history. Helen arrived punctually, with a nervous expression on her face. It was evident she was aware of the magnitude of the moment and what it meant for both of them. Seeing Victoria, she showed a faint smile, as if unsure of how her presence would be received. They both sat in silence, looking at their coffee cups, and for a few moments the atmosphere was so dense that neither seemed to know where to start. Finally, Victoria took the initiative. She took a deep breath and looked her in the eyes, facing the woman who had marked her so profoundly, not only through her choices, but also through her absence. "Helen, Mum," she began, hesitating over the word that still felt strange when referring to her. "I've spent a long time trying to understand what happened. And although I now know your life story and the reasons behind your decisions, it still hurts. It hurts that you left me and chose to start a new life without me." Helen listened in silence, her face reflecting the pain she felt as she heard her daughter express her deepest feelings. When Victoria finished speaking, she lowered her gaze and murmured, "I know, Victoria. And believe me when I say I regret every day of my life for leaving you. I know that nothing I say can erase the pain I caused or the scars I left. But at that time, I was broken, and I thought that leaving was the best choice for you, to give you a life where you would be safe." Victoria looked at her, noticing the vulnerability in her eyes. Though those words didn't lessen her pain, She recognized that Helen had carried a deep guilt all these years. And while she still felt the weight of betrayal, she also realized that the woman before her was simply a mother who had made difficult, perhaps mistaken choices, yet choices filled with pain. "I know you tried to protect me, and maybe that's what saved me," Victoria said, nodding slowly. "But I also spent years feeling that I wasn't enough, that there was something in me not worth loving, and that emptiness has followed me my whole life." Helen looked up, her eyes filled with tears, and took Victoria's hand, her fingers trembling. "Dear, I never wanted you to think that. My absence was never about your worth. You were an amazing child, and I'm sure you've grown into a wonderful woman, even though I wasn't there to see it. Guilt has been my only companion, and I know I was a coward not to search for you, not to confront my past. But every day of my life, I wanted to reach out to you. I just never knew how." They looked at each other in silence, sharing pain and regret. Victoria understood for the first time that her mother wasn't an untouchable figure, but an imperfect woman, filled with fears and mistakes. Though Helen's choices had caused deep wounds, the regret in her gaze was sincere, and Victoria knew in her heart that she no longer wanted to carry the weight of anger and resentment. "Helen, for a long time, I thought I could never forgive you," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "But now, after all I've learned about myself and about you, I understand that forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, but about freeing myself from it. I don't know if we're ready to build something new, but I'm willing to try, with all the time we need." Helen nodded, her eyes filled with tears, and the hope of a future she never imagined began to illuminate her face. She knew the journey would be long, and that rebuilding any bond with her daughter would require patience and understanding. But she also knew that this opportunity, this moment of redemption, was a gift she never expected to receive. "I don't expect you to forgive me completely, Victoria. I know that's something only you can decide over time," Helen whispered, feeling the weight of her own words. "But I promise I won't fail you again, that I won't run away. I'll be here, ready to give you whatever you need, even if it's only my silence and understanding." Victoria took a moment to process those words. She understood that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but rather opening a door to a possible new beginning. Perhaps Helen could never be the mother she had dreamed of, but she could become someone she could trust. At that moment, Victoria decided that her own well-being was most important, and that letting go of resentment would free her from the emotional chains that had held her captive. At the end of their conversation, they looked at each other in silence, each understanding the weight of the years they had lost, but also the value of being willing to try. There were no hugs or promises of a perfect future, only a silent agreement to let time and patience do their work, healing each scar at its own pace. When they said goodbye, Victoria felt lighter. She knew that the reconciliation process would be slow and that there would be moments when the past would hurt again, but, for the first time, she was willing to release that weight. And as she watched Helen walk away, she understood that she had taken the most important step, forgiving herself for the pain she had carried and allowing herself the right to heal. That meeting was just the beginning of a new path, one in which both women would have to learn to know each other and reconcile their differences. But even though there was much left to resolve, Victoria felt that this first step toward redemption was the greatest she could have taken, not only for Helen, but above all, for herself. Since the reconciliation between Victoria and Helen, it had been like a slow spring. Though the wounds hadn't completely healed, Victoria felt the freedom that came with each day of peace, of letting go of the burdens that had marked her for so long. After discussing it with David, they decided to reschedule their wedding, this time not as a grand event, but as an intimate moment shared only with those who had been witnesses and pillars of their healing journey. The wedding took place in a small chapel, surrounded by trees and the warm light of the afternoon sun, symbolizing a rebirth for them both. As Victoria walked down the aisle, she looked at each familiar face and felt a warmth in her heart she hadn't felt in a long time. David waited for her, his face reflecting a mix of love and admiration, and as she approached, she felt all the pain of the past fade away. There was no doubt or shadow. She knew she was ready to take this new step with him. When she reached the altar, David took her hand in his and, without letting go, began speaking from the depths of his heart, with words he had longed to say for so long. "Victoria, I want you to know that no matter what you've been through, nor what we'll face in the future, I love you for who you are, for every scar that has made you stronger, and for the incredible woman standing before me. I know the road has been difficult, and that you've fought against memories and scars that no one should bear alone." He paused, his eyes shining with sincerity. "But from now on, I want you to know that you are not alone. I will be with you every step, every day, loving and supporting you with all my heart, today, tomorrow, and for all eternity." Victoria felt her heart pound at David's words. It was the declaration of love and commitment she had always dreamed of, not because it was perfect, but because he accepted her with all her past, her fears, and her scars. For the first time, she felt free, not having to hide the parts of herself she considered broken or incomplete. "David, you've shown me what true love means. You've seen the worst of me, and you still chose to stay. Thank you for being my support, for giving me the strength I thought I'd never find." With tears in her eyes, Victoria smiled, feeling she had finally found someone willing to walk alongside her, no matter the obstacles. "I promise that by your side, I will also learn to love myself, to accept the past, and to build a future full of love and hope with you." After exchanging their vows, Victoria and David embraced, breaking any barrier the pain of the past had tried to build between them. With sincere and profound love, they sealed their union, and at that moment, they knew they were ready to face life together. At the reception, the atmosphere was warm and filled with genuine smiles. Robert, the loving father who had always been by her side, dedicated a few words to Victoria, thanking her for the love she had given him and for being the light of his life. Moved, Victoria embraced him tightly, acknowledging that he would always be her father, the man who gave her a home and taught her to believe in herself. Shortly after, during the reception, David approached Victoria as soft music played in the background. Placing his hands on her waist, he guided her to the center of the dance floor, where they began to dance in silence, surrounded by their loved ones. "You know, sometimes I feel the universe placed me in your path to show me the value of real love," David said, holding her tenderly. "I love you for everything you are and for everything you've had to face. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your life and for teaching me so much about the true meaning of strength." Victoria looked at him, feeling her fears melt away in David's embrace. She knew she had found in him someone willing to accept her completely, to love every part of her, even the ones still healing. "Thank you, David, for helping me heal and for being the one who never leaves me alone in this battle. With you, I feel that I can finally leave the past behind and build something beautiful." Helen was also there, watching her daughter with a mix of pride and regret. Though she knew the healing process between them would be long, the hope of a renewed bond filled her with strength. Throughout the night, they exchanged shy smiles and a few hugs, small gestures reflecting the beginning of mutual forgiveness and a bond that, while fragile, was beginning to grow again. Elizabeth, David's sister, approached Victoria and thanked her for being an example of resilience and courage, while Robert reminded Victoria that he would always consider her his daughter, regardless of the circumstances. The family, once broken, now found themselves united, with each member supporting each other and giving one another a second chance. The story closed with Victoria and David, surrounded by loved ones and certain they could face any obstacle together. Victoria looked around and for the first time in her life felt complete. The scars of her past would always be there, but now they were part of her story, not as a burden, but as proof of her strength. David took her hand and embraced her one last time as they looked toward the future, knowing that love and understanding would be the force that kept them together forever. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful yet challenging acts a person can experience. It's not simply forgetting or justifying the pain we've been through. It's not erasing scars or pretending there were never wounds. Forgiveness, in its purest essence, is a gift we give ourselves, a release from invisible chains that bind us to the past and prevent us from moving forward. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting or minimizing the pain, but acknowledging it, facing it, and finally letting it go. It's a personal journey without set times or paths, but one that demands courage and a willingness to look ahead. It's understanding that others' actions don't define our worth or the path we want to follow, and that self-love begins when we choose to heal and live free of resentment. Remember, true forgiveness is a gift for your soul, an act of love toward yourself that allows you to build a future where peace and hope have a place. When you learn to forgive, you discover that freedom is possible, and by letting go of the past, you find a path to a life filled with love, understanding, and above all, true fulfillment. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, forgiveness, and healing. Let's remember that we all carry scars, but the real power lies in learning to let them go and move forward. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need a reminder that forgiveness is the first step toward freedom. See you in the next story.